Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Good morning and welcome back to the lecture series on Partition of India in print media and cinema. So, we are going to continue our discussion on history and alternative memory writings, and we are talking about the subalterns and their roles, how the major political parties in post-colonial India have tried to exploit the Dalits for their own interests. The Dalit leaders generally refuse to follow or be included in these major groups, and so there are many instances in the pre-partition and post-partition history of the Dalits being attacked and subjected to brutalities. So, Dalits were seen as empty in their own identity, and so they were seen best suited for proselytization, being converted to another religion, and they would enhance the numerical strength of any religious community. So, this trend continued during the partition. In West Punjab, for example, the Dalits were forced to accept Islam. Ravinder Kaur notes how the untouchables that had hitherto remained socially marginalized were being nationalized through this process of proselytization, and both in Bengal and in Punjab one sees that Shuddhikaran among the Hindus was rampant. It was a process of giving upper caste status to the Dalits. Gyan Pandey therefore wants to understand the violence of partition through the eyes of the victims, and through reading the positions of the aggressors as well as the onlookers, through in other words through the agencies of those that lived through partition. That is where we can actually inscribe the question of struggle and the more nuanced meanings of the past. So, a series of studies focusing mainly on the refugees in Punjab and Bengal explore the struggle of the Dalits for citizenship and the process of rehabilitation. And so, Urvashi Butalia would go on to say that in its most exclusive focus on Hindus and Sikhs and Muslims, partition history has worked to render many others as invisible. One such history is that of the scheduled castes or the untouchables. So, including the Dalits actually renders more complicated meanings to the history of partition. In the case of Bengal, Shekhar Bandyopadhyay has made some prominent and very important contributions through his studying the caste politics in the partition of Bengal, how the caste dimension played a vital role in cracking up of the Bengal. So, the multiple layers within the agricultural peasant communities in East Bengal, according to Bandyopadhyay, precludes any kind of blanket categorization of Dalitness, because when we understand Dalit as a homogeneous caste, we also have to look at the classified or the differential experiences in terms of one's class. So, on the one hand, They were the cases of poverty stricken Dalits that were more concerned with economic upliftment and abolition of social hierarchies. So, there were two types of cases. On the one hand, the poverty stricken Dalits were concerned with economic upliftment and abolition of social hierarchies, and on the other, there were the ones that had already availed upward mobility, and they had started presenting regressive views. They were doubling the upper castes and willing to be institutionally accepted within the fold of the traditional upper caste Hindus. They were emulating the upper caste behavior. So, while most of the Dalits faced subordination by the Hindu refined class people and the elite Muslims, the interest groups were actually bargaining with the mainstream political leaders. So, we have earlier already discussed about the case of Panchanan Burman, who went on to become a barrister from among the Dalits. He was in a position to negotiate the issues of the Dalits with the upper caste political leaders. So, the Hindu Muslim atrocity no longer remained a high caste political affair. The scheduled castes were supporting the mainstream Hindu sentiments. So, there were certain views that were also being forwarded by the Dalit groups. While the leaders from among the Dalits would be against partition. I have Jogendranath Mondal's name in mind. He was an important leader from among the scheduled castes, and he actually opposed partition. However, we see that the majority of the Dalits are influenced either by Congress or by Hindu Mahasabha politicians, and they propose integrationist positions, and they want to see themselves chiefly as part of the Hindu majority nation state. So, they are, I mean, their misplaced or their misinformed support is exploited by the mainstream leaders. So, partition on the other hand does not result in inclusion of the Dalit provinces within India. This is in the case of Bengal. Population vote for partition. Most of their provinces actually go on to become part of East Pakistan, which is now Bangladesh. All the Dalit provinces such as Bakarganj, Faridpur, Jashore, Khulna and Rajbansi areas such as Rangpur, Dinajpur, they all go into East Pakistan. They were mainly agriculturalists, they were landless peasants, they were not prepared with the socio-economic capital to resettle in the new land. So, this political decision of partition which they support, which actually gains their ignorant support, results in undoing their social and political mobility and even their caste based unity. So, the Dalits are actually dispersed all over India. Their choice of living together is not promoted by the host country. So, they have to migrate in destitute conditions and start from the scratch, and they have to actually etch out a living through struggling and fighting with the local Dalit and grassroots populace. So, a decision that was enacted by the elites actually affected the Dalit migrants in the worst way. They were worst hit by the partition, but these are the chapters of history that remain untold. So, in the mid 1940s, we see that Dalits are used as scapegoats in the Hindu-Muslim strife. The Dalits from Namashudra and Rajbansi Santhal groups are included within the Hindu fold through indoctrinations, and they are deployed in the vanguards of Hindu militancy. And it is a strategy used by the Bengal Congress to win most of the scheduled caste seats in the assembly election of 1946. Jitu Santhal's death in police encounter happens when he enacts a debased form of Kali worship in Adina mosque. So, the Hindus provoke a Santhal to worship Kali in a mosque, and it results in his death through police encounter. So, this is one of the numerous incidents of aggression between the Santhals and the Muslims, the Dalits and the Muslims. So, Dalits are used in the vanguard of the Hindu militant groups against the Muslims. So, how Dalit autonomous politics was appropriated to broaden the base of the Hindus in an emergent Indian national politics is an aspect that has been conspicuously underplayed in the official narratives of the subcontinent's partition. Partha Chatterjee as well as other historians like Joya Chatterjee and Shekhar Bandyopadhyay, Ranabir Shamadar, all these historians look at the roles of the Dalits and how they were exploited. The extent to which such understandings are obfuscated or eclipsed by mainstream narratives is underscored by the distinction made by Pandey, by Gyan Pandey, between national progressive history and the local inconsequential histories that can neither be narrativized nor be nor given to any straight-jacketed theorization. So, the concern with negotiating a relationship with the nation by reconstructing a new memory of the past informs the proliferation of Dalit newspapers and journals in northern India. So, through interrogating received histories, the Dalit sphere actually started the process of Dalit awakening. So, through newspapers and journals, one sees how the process of Dalit awakening happens. And we have already spoken about the feminist oral history and its emergence. It talks about the neglect of women's voice in traditional sources, and so oral history becomes an opportunity to integrate the women as subjects into historical scholarship. Sheila Rowbottom notes that women's experiences in historical discourse were often hidden and new methodologies, women's personal testimonies that allowed that enabled challenging historical interpretations based upon the lives and documentations of and by men. So, the parameters, the values, the perspectives were entirely different in subalterns' recording of the past, be it the woman, be it the Dalit. As a methodological tool, oral history complemented rather than competed with official documentary sources. So, the oral histories provided a more comprehensive analysis. They moved away from mere statistics of about women's lives and their conditions, and they enable us to understand the consequences, the aftermath, and not just the event itself. Using of oral testimonies allow or enable one to understand the lived experiences of the ordinary lives. So, oral histories empower the unexpressed utterances which would otherwise remain undocumented. This process, the legitimizing the oral histories, is a way of democratizing the discourses that had till a long time remained within the stronghold of male centric high politics. So, it is also a question of ethical dilemma for the scholars that try to work on oral histories. The question of ethical dilemma is more present when dealing with stories of trauma, forced migration, rape and loss of one's homeland. So, these are emotive subjects that evoke strong responses, and so it is hard to relive the painful experience through the process of recounting the past. So, Bona et al. Says, I quote, "For the oral historians, the interview is always more than the recorded and transcribed words. It is a process in which the narrator, the interviewee, is actively constructing and creating an account, and it is also a question of subsuming the position, the agency of the narrator by the academic, by the scholar and her scholarship. So, there is a power imbalance between the two agents. So, ultimately the interviewer is in a position of greater power through her role of interpreting, recounting, analyzing the interview, and the interviewee, who has actually experienced and who is the center of this entire discourse, has no power or control through the entire process, or has no control over the outcome in the scholarship itself. So, there is a dilemma about the use of these accounts and the radical potential of oral history in reclaiming the past of the ordinary people. Priya Kumar says that it may be apt to describe the past in presentness of partition as a history that is not done with or refuses to be past, unquote. So, I mean, in the Indian subcontinent, the process of territorial consciousness, as Ranabir Samaddar suggests, the moment of partition actually marked the beginning of a territorial consciousness. So, understanding of borders was a result of a geopolitical imagination which actually defines the partition. Gilmartin would further note that for both India and Pakistan, rather than the independence from Great Britain, so for both India and Pakistan, partition was a process of fixing territorial definitions of the nation state much more than it was independence from Great Britain. The divide along communal lines is something that all these subaltern historians go on to question. So, at different junctures in history, there were different micro societies in India that had witnessed different forms of groupism, and these groups were constantly in a state of flux. They would never be permanent fixed groups. The sharecroppers against both the Hindu zamindars and the Muslim landlords and elites. There were the Dalit Hindus against the Hindu elites. The milkman community would be against both the Hindus and the Muslims, and yet out of I mean all these sorts of complexities and heterogeneities, I mean living together, living a life of harmony and living with certain degree of dignity and respect was never thought as impossible. The coexistence of communities were never seen an exceptionally undefeatable problem. So, when we look at partition in literature and media, we look at Derrida's definition of literature serving as a real testimony, and a fiction of testimony more than a testimony in which the witness swears to tell the truth. Fiction opens the possibility for truthful testimony, something that announces its inability to tell the truth, and so it tells the story of its own failure. So, the testimony may assume the autobiographical voice that writes about the singular experience. However, fiction's creative power, so the creative license used by fiction creates an illusion of an I, or maybe the failed I, the I that cannot be, that is able to bear and conceive the unimaginable, the unbearable and the unnameable in a comprehensive way. So, that is the capacity of fiction, which even testimony cannot boast. So, what are the genres that can contain the vast experience, the ramified meanings of partition? So, Anna Bernard would say that Bildungsroman and fragmented narrative are majorly the two forms that replicate the processes through which the event of partition is memorialized, right. So, memorialization is not only through recording the evidences of physical and psychic violence inflicted by the partition, but also creating counterfactual representations of pre-partition history and the post-partition present. So, creating counterfactual representations of pre-partition history and the post-partition present. So, counterfactualism is actually a process of challenging the inevitability or necessity of partition. What if partition did not happen? It encourages the reader to consider other forms of socio-political organizations or a different possible future. It tries to conceive an alternative future. I mean, something that could have come into being or can still come into being. So, that is actually a kind of reversal or making the facts of partition stand on their head. So, partition literature does not necessarily destabilize, interrupt or expose the national narratives, but they can be counterfactualist. They can create parallel facts, and that is where the license of creativity lies. That is where fiction plays a momentous role. It becomes larger in effect than testimony. So, the value of imagination becomes more important than the value of witnessing. Partition literature's capacity to gesture towards and in some cases formally construct vision of collectivity and nationhood based on solidarity, not separation. So, reconstruing new meanings out of the facts given in hand, that is counterfactualism. So, understanding in terms of unity, in terms of harmony rather than separation and competition. So, Shadow Lines by Amitav Ghosh remembers, it talks about the gaps and silences underlying the formation of nation states, and how such silences, when articulated, put these unified, these imaginary communities into a disarray. National memory is constantly evading these newly formed nations. So, Shadow Lines commemorates stories of ordinary Hindus and Muslims that were risking their own lives to save members from the other communities. These stories of harmony, of friendship and humanity, humanity outliving any kinds of animosity, any form of rivalry, are not celebrated in the mainstream discourse. The mainstream discourse always comes across in the form of a dyad, and so nations are constituted as binary meanings, as dyads or oppositional entities. So, in Shadow Lines, the figure of the grandmother who is brought up with the dream of nationalism and a figure that has internalized the language of modernity understands that the state is the only legitimate purveyor of violence. So, the grandmother's dilemma lies in the fact that she is a Hindu from East Bengal. So, her geographies of nationhood is called to question, as she is on the one hand a Hindu woman from East Bengal, and yet her nationality actually is tied up with India, and her current existence overlaps with a geopolitical space that is outside of East Bengal. So, her home and her nationality are not the same, they are at odds with each other. So, the common genres of partition literature could be romance, Bildungsroman and fragmented narratives. When we talk of romance, we are thinking of many artworks that celebrate lovers on opposite sides of the partition. Here I am thinking of Garam Hawa by M.S. Satyu, an important film on partition, which shows how the lovers cannot meet. So, the frustrated love stories in the face of larger communal disturbances. So, love stories that are tragically thwarted, and they are not realized most of the times in exile narrative. So, love stories that are generally not realized, and there is an irreversibility of the pre-partition innocence. The innocence that was enjoyed before the partition can never, the prelapsarian innocence cannot be regained. So, desired union among the lovers intensify rather than undermine the divide. And then the genre of Bildungsroman that aligns the narrator's coming of age with the event of the partition itself. So, Midnight's Children is one of such narratives of coming of age through awareness of the legacy of partition. We are also reminded of Lenny's character in Cracking India, Bapsi Sidhwa's Cracking India, where the child's innocence is taken away by the awareness of communal divides, communal rivalries, and so it is also coming of age story, where the child steps into adulthood. She learns about many adult emotions and is cognizant of these complicated human relations as she witnesses the process of immigration. She witnesses the neighbors emigrating to India. And so, pre-partition period implies childish innocence, whereas post-partition implies disillusionment. So, the pristine innocence before partition is irrevocably lost, and so the dystopia of the present seems almost insurmountable. Nostalgia is constitutively anti-partitionist. Nostalgia is always facing and directed homeward, and the home, the concept of home actually transcends any kind of false boundaries. So, it holds on to the possibility of a different kind of, in other words, a more unified future for the subcontinent. So, Bildungsroman forms features of semi-autobiographical protagonist who is simultaneously anticipating and yet also averting the inevitability of partition. So, partition Bildungsroman depends on partition's historical trajectory as a way of attaining, as a way of obtaining some momentum for the plot, and yet also challenges the belief of permanent communal divide. So, it is following the historical trajectory for the momentum of the plot and yet opposing the precipitating of the partition. It insists on the agency of the individuals to assert the existence of a difficult past and promote a more inclusive form of nationality. And finally, fragmented narrative. In fragmentation, we see representation of the protagonist's inability to understand the total meaning, the entire meaning of the post-partition order. There is a kind of gap in comprehending the significance of this divide. There is a counterfactual potential in reconnecting the fragments and thereby which symbolizes the desire for reunification. Piecing the fragments together would symbolize the desire for reunification or arriving at an imaginative deconstruction and reassembly, which in a way revisits and undoes the exclusionary forms of national identity. So, in Saadat Hasan Manto we see there is a refusal to connect the fragments in order to facilitate any form of reconciled and complete historical memory. So, history is actually torn apart, history is laid asunder and beyond any reconciliation. And so, the question of human forgetting is at the surface. It is something that the reader has to confront. Forgetting of history is something that is impossible in the way Manto presents his stories. And Gyan Pandey would note that the fragments in literature, diaries and testimonies bear the perspectives of the marginalized groups. They act as a rupture in the self representation of particular totalities. All these mini narratives, micro histories actually disrupt the totalitarian understanding of violence or human experience. So, Manto's stories' undecidability, their liminal positionings that counter human forgetting are a way of getting back at the ethical closure of the horrors of partition, the gory events or chapters of partition in favor of celebratory narratives. So, Manto's undecidability or liminality undoes the celebratory narratives. He questions the very possibility of any narrative in the face of the animosities and atrocities that were witnessed before and after the partition. So, with this I am going to stop today's lecture and let us meet again for another round of discussions in the following lecture. Thank you.